Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Great to have you with us. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself? What have you been up to in lockdown? Yeah, go for it.
Yes, great. So I'm Sarah Holmes. I live up on the Wirral near Liverpool, and I teach early childhood at Liverpool Hope University. But for a third of my time at the university, I get to spend researching children's faith and families and how we can support churches in faith nurture and so on. I've also got 4 kids of my own, so that kept me very busy in lockdown. One of whom was about 6 months old at the time, so a whole juggle. And I'm also involved in my local church as a kind of a volunteer, which is exciting. In the past, I've worked as a children and family worker in churches and so on. So I've got a few different hats and so on.
Amazing.
And can I just ask, what's the spread of ages of your children?
Now we've got 2-year-old and then 7, 9 and 11. So just about to get into year 7 and secondary school territory from September. So, yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about the research that you've been doing? I know you've been busy during this pandemic year, and we'd really love to hear about some of the trends and patterns that you've been noticing in seeing how families are engaging with church at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I was just returning from maternity leave when the pandemic struck. Literally, it was my first day back at work when the university was, everyone was heading home to work. So I was kind of sitting there thinking there was obviously loads of talk about education and what was the impact on children of schools being closed, a lot of talk about mental health. But at that stage, there wasn't very much talk about the impact on children's faith. And so I wanted to kind of look and see what was happening from churches' perspectives across the UK, for children and families in that time, but also looking at more recently, I've been comparing different countries and so on and seeing what's happening as well. So I've got a few thoughts. Shall I share my PowerPoint now? And a few things here. So these are some of the kind of trends that I've been noticing. What you might call the marks of COVID on our children, family, youth sort of ministry. Very different stages. Of course, the pandemic has continued to change in terms of restrictions and patterns and so on. And so we've seen different stages: frustration, despondency, confusion, just people not quite knowing. And actually, as part of that, many churches have reported a reduced teams. And this might be perhaps that people who were involved, perhaps sort of more elderly and therefore vulnerable, or perhaps were thinking of giving up, perhaps less committed. They were thinking of giving up before the pandemic, but this was kind of a nudge to do that. So for various reasons, we've seen reduced teams across the country, really, in terms of people involved in children's ministry. I think this is starting to pick up now from what I hear, and people are re-engaging with teams. But still, there is that sense of we're not quite sure what we're doing. We don't know what we can do, what we can't do, and what's okay, what's not okay. Do I have time? Do I have capacity, and so on. So that whole area of teams is really difficult, I think, across churches, but also funding. So, of course, we know that, sadly, the pandemic has caused issues for funding across the board, really, and church is very much included in that. And so I haven't heard in detail about the funding available for children, family ministry, but it's kind of obvious that that's going to be affected in the medium term, really. I think one of the things that kind of has been a bit sad to see is this segregation of ministry, which many people have been talking about. And what I mean by that is that perhaps before there would often be, a time where adults and children would be together in church before they separated off. But actually, because of what's been happening, that's been a lot more challenging. So perhaps when things have been online only, that's been difficult to create. We've all struggled, haven't we, creating things online anyway, but to create things that meet the needs of all ages together has been particularly challenging. I know there have been some amazing examples of where people have made huge efforts to do this, and that's been incredible, but a significant proportion of churches have kind of gone to do things segregated. And what I'm finding as I'm hearing is that now churches are starting to meet in person again. Actually, this segregation is continuing. So partly because of restrictions. So it's difficult having lots of people in one room together. So it's easier to have the children in one room for the whole time and the adults in one room for the whole time, and to have none of that sort of walking around and so on. But it is leading to this kind of sad trend that I see, that we're not having children. So, in my church, my kids are in the hall for the whole time, and I'm in the church room with the adults. And so my kids are not seeing adults worshipping. They're not seeing prayer and all that kind of thing that is so rich as part of the experience of being part of church life. So I think that's a significant thing that we need to be aware of. Of course, it's challenging to think about how we can get around that, and that'll be different in everybody's context. But to really think about this thing of how can we see more joined up worship, more kind of observing one another, and more kind of coming together of the generations. The next point you'll see there, exhausted parents. I don't think I need to explain that much more. I can very much resonate with that. I've got 4 kids myself, and the pandemic has been very exhausting in terms of trying to homeschool, juggle family life, juggle church responsibilities and work responsibilities too. And for many, many people, that would be the same. And I think we need to be realistic about that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, in terms of, as churches, what we expect of parents and what how we can support parents in that, because that's something which is really, really key, that we're so aware of that. But alongside that, there's a point there about decreased engagement from parents, and I'm hoping, again, looking at the poll, we see there that most parents are sort of coming back, most families are sort of returning and so on, and that's great to see, because actually, for a lot of the time, people were struggling, perhaps finding the time or the energy or the motivation to get the kids to log on to the weekly Zoom, the church Zoom or something, and everyone was zoomed out from homeschooling and all that kind of thing. Actually, that did lead to decreased engagement. And I've put that from parents because what, as well as another pattern that I've noticed, is that often, particularly when things were online, there was this thing of, kids, will you go over there, log on to that Zoom call with church and do that over there, and I'll go and do 50 million jobs while I've got 20 minutes to myself. And of course, that's the need of the time, perhaps, but it is meaning that there is a kind of a lack of engagement there of parents and family faith, which again is something that we'll talk about a bit more later. Of course, there's been the flip side, where we've also seen some parents being incredibly active in terms of faith in the home and so on. But I think in significant numbers, we've seen decreased engagement. And then the final point there I've put is some marginalisation. So I think we're probably all aware of the incredible difficulties that there have been for children with special needs and learning disabilities and so on through this time, because so much of the support was cut, so much of the provision in the whole sector has been cut, and families have been really struggling. And I think from a church perspective, it's been sad to hear that many families with children with learning difficulties or special needs have been feeling isolated, and that they haven't been able to connect in. Often, so in some cases, the online platform has actually helped, and so children perhaps who are anxious about going out, or for other reasons, going to church physically was a barrier, actually could connect online, and so that's been helpful. But also, for the vast majority, it hasn't really worked. Of course, for younger children, online things were really difficult. And actually, as we were trying to return to some kind of physical meeting now with young children, that's also challenging. So I now have a 2-year-old. I'm highly aware that they don't stay still, they don't social distance, they can't kind of follow the rules, and so that is leading to marginalization of those families with particularly young children. So they're my sort of big things, and I think it's led to what are some great divides, really, and I've got the kind of the picture of the barrier there, because I think this is what many children and families are experiencing. Of course, I think we're all aware of the access issues with technology and so on. That's been talked about a lot. I've mentioned SEN children and so on. Some have found it help, but for many it's been a barrier. Geographically scattered. So, for some churches who were able to go around visiting each of their families numerous times during lockdown because they all live close, that's been wonderful. But for many churches, actually, if they're geographically scattered, that's just not been possible, and that's been really challenging. But the point there at the top about the input of faith during this time, I think for me has been one of the biggest trends, if you like, the biggest flags, I guess, for us to be aware of. So I've just got one more slide to show you at this stage. Now it looks a bit scary, but it's not, I don't think. So this was me trying to work out in a picture, because I like diagrams, what has this experience been like for children? And so in this first scenario here, we see that there's been a little bit or very little family faith input. So God perhaps hasn't been mentioned at all during this 18 months in the family home. Perhaps children haven't really seen their parents praying, or they haven't really talked about the Bible. Church discipleship perhaps has been very, very limited as well, because perhaps the kids haven't really attended Zoom services. Perhaps they weren't able to access when face-to-face started again. And in terms of faith role models, perhaps those children also didn't really have faith role models actively around in their life. And so we see there that the impact of that is that the child's individual faith hasn't really grown very much. And there's various other scenarios here. But if I flick to scenario 4 here, where we're actually seeing great input in all of those areas. So there has been significant support for the child's faith in the home. There has been significant input in terms of church discipleship. So the child has been engaging with church and so on, and the child has had some kind of excellent and rich role models of faith. And that has led to a really rich and significant growth of the child's faith. Of course, there's all sorts of parameters and arrangements. Children will have had different experiences. But I think we need to be aware of this as churches, that every single child will have had a different experience. So when kids come back to our church groups, they may be sitting there having literally not heard about God for 18 months, not heard or seen anybody praying, not heard anything about faith for that whole time. And on the flip side, we might see children who've had a very rich experience in that way. And so I think we need to be aware of this as churches in terms of this great disconnect and this disparity of experiences that we've been having. So if I flick back to that original slide there, in terms of the great divide, I think we have a huge divide in terms of the experience of what faith input children and families have had over this time. So they're just some of the thoughts. I'll stop screen sharing now because I know we were going to pop into breakout groups to talk about that.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really aware. I was just thinking of that last diagram of sort of how much the child's individual faith will have grown, and actually the one where family input was huge. Actually, it seems as though the growth in that child's faith development is bigger than if they've just had really good church inputs. So that's quite striking. Can you?
Yeah, and that was coming through time and time again in the conversations I was having with various different churches, different leaders, different children's leaders, different parents, that it was in this time where there was intentional activity at home in terms of faith nurture, that was having a much more significant impact than if they were attending the weekly Zoom church and so on. So again, we'll talk a bit about that a bit more later, because I think it's really been coming out strongly in this time, the impact that parents and family does have and can have on a child's faith.
And I know we'll talk this later, but we want the best of what's happened in this year to continue, really.
Sorry, I slightly lost my Wi-Fi then.
So I guess my hope is as we're re-engaging as churches that we take the best of what's happened in this last year and think about how faith nurture at home is still really, really important, even though we might still be able to run our children in youth groups. We are going to head out into a 5-minute breakout group now. And what we'd like you all to discuss is, what's struck you from what Sarah's just said, what's resonated, and, what do you notice from your own context? And is there anything that has surprised you in any way? just also to say that we will, if you've got any questions, do put them in the chat. And thanks to Heather, who's already done that. And we will come back to anything that we feel is unanswered towards the end. So feel free to put those in the chat at any time. And yeah, we'll go back. We'll see you in about 5 minutes after your breakout groups. So see you shortly.
Aika, what struck you about what Sarah's been saying?
I think on one point of view, I kind of feel as though it shows that everybody, we're all in the same boat. There's not one church that's doing better than another one. We're all slightly struggling with this and wondering whether our family's going to come back. And my other thought was, so that makes me feel better, you know. But then the other thought was actually the missed, are we going to miss a generation? So anybody who's had a baby in the last year, and we know that church and toddler groups have a really key role for those people. They might not have been to anything like that. So how do we go about making contact with some of those families, particularly if somebody's going back off maternity leave now, then they've missed that opportunity to have a connection with the church that they might not have done normally. So that's something that I think is worth thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, what struck me is the potential power of family discipleship and that space. Like if a family is engaging with that and discipling within the family, discipling children within the family, I think just seeing the sort of influence, even if that's the only area that's been engaged with, the power of that in the child's faith, I think is a really interesting observation, Sarah, that you found. And for me, is like, well, how as the church are we helping parents to feel empowered? Because so often I did my dissertation on this topic for my degree, and it's like so often parents are like, I'd love to, I just don't know where to start or what that looks like, or they don't feel like they're sort of mature enough in their faith to share it. And I think there's a big bit of almost debunking and like clarifying, actually it doesn't need to be a big sort of theological process that you go through or teaching that you go through with your children, but just simply sharing what faith looks like for you in your everyday life is powerful enough. So Sarah, as we're restarting our groups and thinking about sort of faith development and how we transmit faith within our churches, within families, what do you think like our aims and purposes can be in doing that, and what do you think that can look like for each of us?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one because I was speaking with a colleague in the Netherlands. Actually, we were sort of comparing different experiences of churches, and she talked about it very much like an X-ray. So that you know, what has happened in this whole time has shown things that were there all along, but perhaps we were less aware of. And so actually, it's, you know, there's been much talk about this, hasn't there? About let's take the opportunity to you know, evaluate and reflect on things while we have the chance. And so I think this is a really key time for us to do that, partly because we've kind of had to, because we couldn't just continue as we did before, but also actually it is an opportunity to do that. So I'll just share, got slides here. So here we have a few different measures that we could use. You know, we could probably sit around all day evaluating what we're doing and so on. But, you know, I'm so aware that people are exhausted. You know, teams are exhausted, parents are exhausted, everyone's exhausted, everyone's kind of fed up and so on. And so we need to, whilst we are evaluating, we also need to be balancing that with re-envisioning and re-inspiring and kind of helping people to refine the passion for this kind of this area of ministry and so on, because it is such a difficult time that we're in. And this shows here, just when I was speaking to various people, there aren't numbers on here, but it shows the proportion of people, what people's kind of focus was. And so we see that the biggest number of people were reporting that they wanted to do that. They wanted to reflect on what their church's strategy and vision was for children and family ministry, but also that's closely followed by pastoral care and connecting, which I think somebody's just been speaking about that, perhaps in the chat, about actually finding out what are the needs of families and so on, and that's driven by, or that very strongly connected with pastoral care. And then this supporting faith in the home. So that has been a significant thing that churches have been wanting to do to support families in in doing that, in how they can support faith in the home. Again, we'll talk about that shortly. And then various other things, looking down to having a family focus, perhaps more than separate units of looking at children and adults separately. How can we work with families more? That's been kind of a very a strong theme that's emerging that people are starting to do, because especially with the whole bubble thing and we can't cross households and so on, actually there's a lot more we can do if we keep the family units together and minister together to the family units. Strengthening children's team. Some were saying we just can't plan ahead because of the uncertainty. So this was back in January time, this research particularly. But I think it's still what a lot of people are feeling, obviously shown by the announcement yesterday. We still can't. Still, it is difficult to plan and so on. Significant proportions were saying they wanted to just re-establish what they previously had. And I think actually we're seeing that even more now. So this was a smaller proportion, but I think probably now if we did this again, we'd perhaps hear people saying that's just what we want to do. We don't have the energy to think of new things. We don't know what we can change or so on. Let's just get back to what we were before. And I do think in some cases that's natural and that's what we want to do. But in some cases that is a missed opportunity. Supporting parents in daily life and connecting with fringe families. Now, fringe families, I think, is a huge area which has been really difficult to connect with in this time. Many churches reported that they didn't really have contact details, particularly for people like toddler groups, often perhaps where they sort of drop in, didn't keep contact details and so on. And so it's been really difficult to connect with those families in this time, and we've just lost touch. So I think maintaining connection with fringe families, it was interesting that only a small number of churches were actively trying to do that in that deep lockdown time. But I think going forward, that's something for us to be aware of, how can we re-engage with these families and so on. So here are a few of my thoughts as we perhaps sit here and think about what are our aims and what can we do and so on. So children don't sit still, children are curious. And I think that with all of these restrictions and so on, perhaps we've forgotten that. And so we've done this sort of, let's sit and do the Zoom and so on, or let's get children to sit. So I've seen many examples now where churches are returning to physical meeting of children's settings, but they have to stay sitting in their own section, in their own area. So obviously to maintain the distancing and so on. But how can we also remember that children do need to move about, and actually children engage so much better when they're kind of active and so on, and they are curious, they're wanting to explore and discover, and what is our aim and our purpose. And I think this is a hugely important one, Katie, I can't remember who said this, what is our aim? What are we trying to do? Because I think it's closely connected with what kind of faith are we wanting for these children to have? What kind of experience are we wanting them to have in these things that we're doing? Because are we wanting them to just be able to recite the Bible to us, and to learn all about the Bible stories and regurgitate them? Or are we wanting them to be able to be good people, good moral people, to make good choices, to be kind, to be nice, to share their toys, that kind of thing? Or are we wanting them to be active in their prayer life? Are we wanting them to actually hear a Bible passage and think, right, okay, how might that challenge what I'm doing and how I'm living out my life this week? And so I do think we need to be quite targeted in what we're doing, rather than just simply saying, okay, let's get the book out again. We've got these 52 weeks to fill. We've got this program here. Okay, and we'll just kind of go back to the beginning and start going through. But actually to think, hang on a minute, is that actually what our aim is? What kind of faith we're wanting in the children? Are we actually challenging them in getting these biblical truths into their life and their prayer life and so on? And so the last point there, what kind of faith are we fostering? But also, what role do the children have to play as part of this? And I do think that within this, it's really important that we think of this. So we talk a lot in the early childhood sector about child-initiated play, child-initiated learning, and so on. And so a child, I don't know, let's think of a 3 or 4 year old. There's no point me saying, okay, come and read this extensive book of poetry. Why are you not reading it? What's the problem? Well, that's not where they're at. However, if they pick up a book about a building site and diggers and all that kind of thing and bring it to me, then I know, okay, this is something that interests them. So perhaps what could we do to explore this area a little bit more? And so therefore, from a faith perspective, how could we kind of translate this across? So perhaps a child who is 3 or 4, a child who's 7 or 8 or 11 or whatever age we're thinking, what are they interested in? Let's not just say, okay, we've got this program. Okay, we're going to start in Genesis. We're going to go all the way through the Old Testament. Because is that actually kind of what they need at this time? Is that actually where their faith is at? Or can we ask them, okay, kids, what kind of topics do you think would be interesting to talk about? Do you want to talk about prayer? Do you want to talk about, compassion and caring for those in our community? Do you want to talk about how we can talk about Jesus to our friends? Or what? So really thinking about what is the role that children have to play, and we'll talk about that a little bit more further on. But I think it's really important that we think about the needs of the children. And so here I've got, listen to the needs, listen to these, listen to these, and then seek to meet those needs. And again, I think kind of a symptom of all that we've been experiencing is that in kind of panic, we just kind of, as churches, we've just been doing whatever we could as an automatic and perhaps instinctive kind of thing. Right, let's get the book out. Let's go through the Old Testament. Let's go through parables. And we're kind of picking out these things that we've done before. But what are their needs spiritually at this time? And I say that, what are their spiritual needs, very deliberately, because sometimes I think as churches, we are so keen, we want to have a really fun time. Let's do lots of games. Let's do lots of, icebreaker things and all this sort of thing. And that's great. But actually, children can play games in lots of other settings. Children can do those things elsewhere. But what are their spiritual needs? And I think with that, also thinking about people. Here we are. It's not about the program, it's about the people. And I so strongly believe that this is what makes this like the USP, the unique selling point of church, is that we have people. We have people who care. We have people of all different ages. We have role models of faith for our kids and for our families too, for our parents to see these role models of faith. And so I really kind of find it tricky when we hear about churches just going back to doing the program. And there was somebody who made this point in the chat earlier on. How do we re-engage with things when actually there is separation? And how do we stop people just from going back to the program? I think it's about people. I think we say, okay, we don't need to have a completely polished, perfect curriculum to share with our kids every week. We don't have to have perhaps, if I think back to how many hours of my life I've spent cutting out circles or something for craft activities, and actually, has that actually impacted children spiritually? Possibly, but probably not a huge amount. But if I think about how many times I've sat and had a conversation with children or with parents as well about, this is what God's been challenging me about, or this is what God's been encouraging me about, or how are you doing? What can I pray for you? Actually, those moments actually have been probably a lot more powerful and a lot more impactful on children's faith and so on. So I think this point here is not about the program, it's about the people, is a huge point that we need to be thinking about as we're evaluating what we're doing and so on. And then thinking also, I've said already about child-led ethos. And I don't mean here, let's, get the kids up to teach us all and everything, because, there is a balance. We do have things that, that children are needing and wanting to learn, but also we need to hear what is it that they're wanting to learn, and to have that kind of child-led approach. What are we basing our curriculums, our activities and so on? And building bridges. So again, back to a comment in the chat there. People are used to separated ministries now. People are used to having the kids in one room, the adults in another. And this is something that a few of the participants in the research said to me, actually, there's perhaps a problem here, because adults now are used to a very sanitized, quiet, calm, worshipping experience. They're not used to now a 3-year-old running through shouting, or somebody crying at the back, or children walking through, or whatever. And that is a challenge. And so how do we, there was this question in the chat, how do we get back to that? How do we see those boundaries built, having bridges built across and so on? Well, I think it's this thing of returning to people. And, how can we, in our own churches, it'll all be in different ways, but things like even buddying up families, or, there were some things I heard about, getting children to write notes or little prayer cards or things, and giving them to the older generations within the church, and vice versa, getting some of those older generations, many of whom have lots of time and could just send little notes or messages encouraging. But let's try and do it from a faith perspective as well, not just, here's a nice note, you're a nice person, but here's a Bible verse that really challenged me, or here's a Bible verse to encourage you, or what can I pray for you for? How can we encourage children? There's been perhaps prayer messages sent around churches, things that need prayer for. How can we involve children in that as well, so that children feel that their prayer life is valued and is part of it, and is part of church life? Also, things like, perhaps not just thinking about the Sunday context. Let's say the actual, 10:30 on a Sunday, we've got an hour. What can we do? But are there things that we can do outside of that, in the week or on Saturdays, whatever, so that perhaps we can try and break down some of these boundaries? Of course, we have restrictions, but are there just even going for walks together, or that kind of thing? How can we break down some of those boundaries? But I think there needs to be intentionality about it. So we can't just say, well, hopefully one day we'll have children and families together again, but actually saying, right, we need to think in our context, what are the 2 or 3 little things that we can do? It doesn't need to be totally changing everything about, but what are the few little things that we can do in our setting that will work to deliberately mix up those ages? And perhaps, one thing I've heard that's working really well, if we're having children and adults in different rooms, could we even just have children recording some prayers, and that's played into the adult service, or adults recording something and that's played in? Or even could they join together? This technology thing that we have, could we have 5 or 10 minutes of the service which is live streamed to each other, and that we can have some kind of act of worship together? So those sorts of things suddenly transforms it, because children can see adults worshipping, children can see faith lived out, and so on. But very much not a one size fits all. So again, one of the things we talk a lot in early childhood, the kind of the EYFS, this program that's followed in the early years education, is this unique child, and this sense that every child is different, every family is different. We can't say, okay, here is what every single family needs, let's do that as a church, but we need to be listening. And and I think alongside that, to be kind of working with parents, and so I'll pop that up there actually, because I think there's a huge disconnect. When we listen to families, we're hearing what they really need and want, and yet I think as churches we're presuming that we know what they need and want. So I've heard of cases where there has been perhaps here we know you need like 20 million, well, perhaps that's an exaggeration, colouring sheets. You just want your children keeping busy, so here's lots and lots of colouring sheets, and I'll deliver them to you every week, and here's colouring sheets, get your children colouring. But actually, perhaps not everybody likes colouring. Perhaps people, that there is perception that people want to be separate from their kids. But actually, if we listen, we hear that they don't want to be separate. Some may want to be, and all that kind of thing. And so we need to be listening. But also very much this point, and I think somebody was saying this in the chat, about how we help parents to see, I can't remember exactly what was said, it was about how we help parents to realise that actually it's not just about the Sunday thing, but about throughout the week and so on, and how we equip and empower Christian parents. I was talking about this just this week with a local church, because many Christian parents don't even comprehend that they've got anything to do with this. We have this notion that we take our kids to school to learn, and then they come home to play. Maybe they do half an hour of homework, but actually, if we can get away with that, we perhaps don't bother. But I think in the same way we perpetuate this in our churches, that they come to church, they go in the other room to have the magic happen, and there's something special goes on in that room that sorts them out spiritually, and then we go home for the rest of the week. But actually, I think some very simple things, just drip feeding into the ethos of our churches, that actually the parents do have a part to play in this. So, for example, when we're praying for people, at the end of the service, even, okay, off you go to your weeks, we'll pray for you in the work that you're doing. We'll pray for you in the parenting that you're doing. We'll pray for you that you can help children and so on. Perhaps even mentioning every now and then in sermons, here's a thing you could try with your kids at home. You could all sit around the table and talk about this Bible verse, or in the weekly newsletter that you send out, could you perhaps put a question or a Bible verse and say, it'd be really good to talk about this in your household, just for 2 minutes around the dinner table or something. So just drip feeding these little things, so that actually there is this change of mindset that actually is something to do with the parents, but also for many who feel that they can't do it. They don't know what to do. They're not, got theology degrees or anything, but all they need to do is let their children see them praying. I think for me, one of the most memorable moments, I feel a bit emotional even saying that, one of the most memorable moments of the pandemic for me was, well, literally, it was horrendous. We were having such a battle with homeschooling, and everything that you could imagine was going wrong. And the toddler was just, doing a toddler thing, and it was horrendous. And I literally remember just sitting there in the midst of my kids and just crying. And I said, kids, let's just pray. Let's pray. And I sat there and I said to them, we need God to help us in this, because it's just awful. And we sat there and we spent 10 minutes praying together. And I think that moment for my kids was so impactful. And I reminded them of that, and I said in weeks ahead and even months ahead, I said, do you remember that moment was horrendous? There were many more horrendous moments too. But, and I say to them, can you see how God helped us through that time? And that's the reality. There was nothing particularly planned about that moment. There was nothing particularly theological about it. It was just a real moment that I kind of brought God into that moment. And I think that the more we can do this with our families, the better, really. So I think we'll pause there, because I think we're going to go back to breakout groups for a moment. So I'll pass back over to you guys from those thoughts.
Something I want to pick up on a question, Sarah, that we've had in the chat. You mentioned earlier on about trying to find out what the spiritual needs of children are. And the question here is, have you got any tips for how to find out what children's individual spiritual needs might be? Because it seems that each child may have a different need, and it feels slightly overwhelming to connect with each of them when time is short on a Sunday. And I guess my further question to that I work with teenagers. I've got 4 teenagers in my house at the moment. And when I ask them, well, how are you doing, or what do you need? Sometimes the response is, I don't know. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the thing, isn't it? We usually don't know what we don't know or what we need until we've had it. It's kind of retrospectively, we think, oh yeah, I needed to hear that, or I needed to know that, or whatever. So so I think it's a really, really good point that we can't just say to children, right, can you sit here? Can you just do me a list, please? What do you need from God, or what do you need from the church? But it's really interesting. Actually, we're just about to, I'm not doing this as like a plug, but we're just about to launch quite a significant survey. There's 5 different countries we're doing it together to ask families about their spiritual needs and so on at the moment, and children and so on. And I think that's hopefully that will kind of bring some really interesting things in. But I think at a very local perspective, I often think of the kind of at school we have the parents' evening type thing, and perhaps we go there and they say, I've noticed that your child is this is usually what my kids get, they're not doing very well in their spelling test. Could you perhaps do a little bit more spelling practice, and then yeah, okay, we'll do that. And I kind of think actually we can't do this kind of thing in isolation. We need to be working with the parents. It needs to be a partnership thing, because actually if I see children on a Sunday morning for 1 hour, how on earth can I know what's going on in their world, spiritually or in any other way? Yet the parents do know that. So I think very strongly there needs to be a working together, a kind of partnership. And maybe it's perhaps not as formal as a sort of a 10-minute parents' evening type thing. But actually, and I know that time is an issue, obviously, for many people involved in this sort of ministry. But if there are ways that we can foster better partnership together, I think that will be really, really valuable. So even if it's, little emails from time to time back and two with families, or just little chats at the end of the service, saying to a parent, how's your child getting on with prayer? Is there anything we can do, to support them? Or that sort of thing, I think is really, really interesting. But I think perhaps in terms of speaking with children themselves, even just to say to them, what's something that you find. This is the thing, actually. I did some research many years ago from a PhD, really. And all I did was I went to about 60 different families every year for 3 years, just had a chat with the kids. What do you think about God? What do you think about church? And all I did was I asked them questions. And the parents were allowed to, not allowed to, but the parents were asked to observe, but not join in. And time again, they said to me, I didn't know my child thought that. I didn't know they thought so deeply or they experienced those things. And all I did was ask a question like, have you ever prayed? And how did that go? And I think sometimes we think there's like some kind of magic formula that we have to apply to access the child's kind of spiritual activity or thoughts or whatever. But it's really not that complex. So I think literally to just say to kids, what do you think of what do you think about how God's been working as part of COVID, and just see what they say, and that might raise things like, well, actually, I'm really cross with God. I hate him. I don't want anything to do with him anymore because of COVID. Or it might raise things of, well, I'm really upset because this is happening and I'm trying to pray to God and ask him for this. Or they might be incredibly, you might think, goodness, they're praying every day about this, or, they've been telling their friends about God. And just a simple question like that, we suddenly hear this is where they're kind of connecting with God. Other things you can do is just get them to draw pictures. Maybe we just say, okay, kids, the activity today is, could you draw a picture of something you want to say to God about what's happening now? And then have a little chat with them. What's your picture? What is this about? And how can we pray together for this? And so those sorts of things. But just simply to be asking questions and seeing what sort of things arise, really. So they're just some of my thoughts there.
Thank you. I've just put in the chat, actually, Church of England have a resource called Learn to Listen. That was produced a number of years ago, but on it there are a number of different exercises for different age groups of how you can start some of these conversations in really creative ways, and particularly for the younger age groups. I mean, I know when time is short and if you've got a group of sort of 10 children, a really easy one that I've done is a would you rather game. And it's like, would you rather pray out loud, you run to that side, or pray in your head? And you can, the younger kids are really quite open, and you can judge from your group quite quickly some of their sort of preferences for when you're in the group, which you can then follow up with parents or with individuals a bit later. So would you rather read the Bible or watch a Bible story on YouTube, and just little things like that to help you steer the group. So
yeah. Or even, just say to kids, what questions would you like to ask God? Things like that. You'd be amazed what comes out. Just, and something which I've observed, there's a guy who's doing online webinars that once a month that my kids quite like to watch, and he does the whole thing. And at the end, he says, any questions, type them in the chat. And my kids love it. And they put all these questions, and all the other kids that are engaging do. And I think we sometimes underestimate the questions that kids have, and they're really profound sometimes. Sometimes they're really, simple, like, what do you want for lunch, or what's your favorite food? But sometimes they're like, why does God allow suffering, and these kind of things. And sometimes they're hard, and that's okay. And we could say, let's come back to that next week, and we'll give it some thought. But actually, for kids to have the opportunity to ask those questions is very revealing in terms of where they're at and where we need to be pointing our programs. And like you say, the would you rather type thing is a very quick way to do that, or kind of unpack it a bit more and so on. But yeah, kids have so much going on in their heads that it's not that tricky to access just with a few thoughts like that. Yeah.
So we're just now sort of final few minutes of discussion here. We were wondering, how do you see the role of children in the process of re-engaging families, and what does working with the whole family look like? Have you got some thoughts that you could share on that, please?
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we do consider this, because in many other sectors that work with children or families, actually they pay huge heed to what the needs of the child are. If you go to entertainment centres, soft play places, or bigger theme parks or whatever, it's all about what will meet the needs of the child. What can we do to get? Often it's more money, but what do the kids want? Because we want to keep them here longer and that kind of thing. We want them to want to come back. But sometimes as churches, we don't necessarily do that. We kind of think, what's the bare minimum we can get away with to get through this moment? And so here, I've just got a few thoughts, a few questions perhaps that we could ask, and I'll share those here. So why do they come to church? Why are children coming to our church? Or perhaps why are they not coming? How do they feel when they arrive? And I think these are perhaps some questions that would be good to discuss as kind of leadership teams, PCCs, those sorts of things. What actually, let's be really evaluative, if that's a word, and think about what is a child's experience? What is a family's experience when they come to church? So I have to confess, I arrived at church this Sunday for the first time taking my 2-year-old since all of this COVID. And the person on the door said to me, "Oh, welcome. You can relax now you're here." And I thought, no, I can't. Actually, this is probably one of the most stressful moments of my week, because I've got to now entertain my 2-year-old. He can't move because of social distancing and so on. I've got an hour and a half, to try and do that. And actually, that's the reality of many families. And so we need to be thinking about that. We need to be, really aware. What are they experiencing? How does it feel? Does it feel like they have to sit there still? Does it feel to them like everybody's staring at them if their child cries? Even if that doesn't happen, how can we really think about that, what it feels like for children and families? I think one of the things that I come back to time and time again is this thing that if families get into the pattern and the habit of attending church or being involved in church in whatever way that might be when their child is young, so when they're like 1 or 2 years old, that pattern will probably be very, very embedded. But if people think, oh, you know what, Sundays are a chance for me to have my lie-in, or, go and meet my friend or visit family or whatever, that pattern will become embedded. And they're very, very unlikely, I think, from 3 years old, once their family ethos and pattern and habits are developed, they're very unlikely at that point to then suddenly think, oh, you know what, I've been having lovely Sunday mornings, but I'm going to now change all that and I'll start going to church. That's very unlikely to happen. And yet, to attend church with a very young child is a very difficult experience often. So what can we do to help people in that way in our settings, just to make it feel easier, to make them feel valued when they arrive, to make them feel they can relax and we will help them and we don't mind if there's a bit of noise. But also thinking of older children and young people too. What role do they have in church? Why do they come? Are they coming because they're made to, or are they coming because they want to? And what is making them want to come? And I do think this thing about having a role. So, we've heard about times when children perhaps come and, read the Bible reading for the day, or perhaps come and get involved in the prayers, or perhaps help on welcome on the door. Yes, these things are a bit tricky because of COVID, but not insurmountable. I think that we can easily get around these things. Perhaps do children have a role for, even contributing to the weekly news sheet or something? Could they give a thought for the day or something like that on there? But also, what is the child's voice in the church? To what extent now, it seems to be a growing movement where people are having like a child's PCC or a child's spokesperson on the PCC, or perhaps they have their own PCC and then feed into the PCC. But this kind of thing of actually involving children's voice is really, really, really important, I think. And in terms of shaping our future strategies and so on as church, and then connecting with their families. So it's not just about kids, but connecting with families as a whole. And I'm just looking down here to make sure that we've picked up on things that were in the chat, because I think we're talking about this, how to connect with families as a whole unit rather than separately and so on. And I think that we've already touched on this a little bit, but making it easier for them to attend, but affirming what's going on in terms of their kind of spiritual activity in the week and so on. And my kind of one thing I think is very powerful. So when I was speaking before about difficult moments, and we pray in those moments, but actually helping people to go back and recall and say, you know what, God's been here with that. And so I haven't done this yet, but one of the things that I've been pondering doing is because I know that somebody said in the comments section, how do we start to reconnect with families and so on? Perhaps put on a one-off event, to help parents to help families as a whole unit to reflect on everything that's been going on. And I'm kind of thinking, for example, of having, people attend in family groups. They sit on their own table as a family group so that they're in that thing. It might be on a Saturday afternoon, it might be on a Sunday afternoon. So it's a different time to a service, but that families could come and we have some kind of possibly active worship, but some kind of interactive thing where families can discuss together some questions, just to give them some questions, perhaps give them some activities like draw a picture together about, what's been the best bit of pandemic life for you, what's been the worst bit, what has been something that God's helped you with in this time. Perhaps we could have some Lego on each table so that they could build something together of a Bible story that they found impactful during this time. And in that way, what we're doing is we're inviting families back into church and saying, you're welcome here, come and join us again. But also we're trying to help people to reflect back and to see how God has been working in their lives and so on, and to therefore then discuss that as a family, so that suddenly kids, even if they haven't been discussing that in their home, suddenly they're hearing their parents labeling those things and remembering them back. And one of the passages that I really find quite inspiring is in Joshua, where God stopped the River Jordan from flowing. And then they made this monument. They got the stones out of the river and they put the big monument, and they said, we have this monument to remember all that God has done for us. So, I wonder at this time of the pandemic, if in some way, perhaps an event like I've just described, or in some other way, how can we help families in our churches to have that marker point and to say, right, this is all that's happened in the last 18 months or whatever. How can we see the marks of God working throughout that? And to kind of have that as like a label or a monument or like a memory kind of for families to connect with together, I think is really powerful. And so I'm very aware of time. So just one final thought here. This, I don't know if people are aware of this document. Chris Whitty mentioned it in one of the briefings a few months ago. The British Academy basically came together to look at what are the impacts of COVID on society generally, not just the kind of medical impact. And this is a quote which I find really inspiring for us as the church. History shows that pandemics and other crises can be catalysts to rebuild society in new ways. But this requires vision and interconnectivity between policy makers at regional, local and national levels. And it really struck me as a church, actually, this is an exciting opportunity, but it's one that we need to be very intentional about connecting together and about kind of policy making. And so these are some thoughts that I'm just going to kind of throw out and kind of possibly not to really talk very much about. But I think we need to be very intentional. I think we need to be looking at our policies, looking at our strategies and saying, how do we need to be reshaping some of this? And, in terms of, I think there's been various comments in the chat there about how do we do this? For people, perhaps leadership teams who are not sure what to do, perhaps for people who now are used to the adult way of being in church without kids and so on. And I often think about my experiences of decorating at home, because for many, many years, me and my husband have argued, not in a very Christian way, about how we'll decorate the house. And every time we come to do a room, we have this conversation. I say, what about this wallpaper? No, I don't like it. What about this one? No, I don't like it. What about this one? Don't like it. And he literally doesn't like any of it. And then we always come to the point where I say, right, I'm just going to do this one. He goes, oh, all right then. And we do it and he loves it. And now we've come to the place in our marriage where basically he says, you know what, I just can't visualize it. Just kind of do it. And then he always likes it afterwards. It's all good. But I think that's often what happens in our churches, is that it's really difficult to envision what it could be like. And so for those of us who are involved in this sort of sector, this kind of leadership, it's somehow painting a picture of what it could be like. What could it be like to have our children involved? I'll just stop the screen share there. What could it be like to have our children involved in the PCC? What could it be like to have children more involved in our services? What could it be like for families to find it easy to attend on a Sunday? What could it be like? And to paint these pictures and to share these visions with people. I think that's pretty much one of the most powerful things that we can do. So I'll leave that thought with you there.
Thank you, Sarah. Because of time, we're not going to go into our last breakout group. We think we're going to just jump into the Q&A now. But Levi has already put the question in the chat about what one thing are you taking away from this session, and how will it shape you and what you're doing in your families, in your community. So I still want you to think about that, everybody. Think about what's the one thing you are going to take away. Sarah, I just wanted to pick up on, you mentioned doing like an event and having families there to reflect on the last year. I think that's a fantastic idea. I think some of the beauty of that is then having families hear the stories of other families at that time and what their picture looked like as well. And that will help with those sort of reconnecting with each other, because we don't know whether families have, some of them will have friendships outside of church, but not all of them will be. So that's another way that families can reconnect with each other, by hearing their God story from this last year as well. So I think that's really great. Katie, have you got any reflections?
Yeah, I think it always just strikes me, it's probably just because I'm passionate about this area, but how we can empower parents. And I really love your idea of like gathering families around the table and having that conversation of going, what have you seen God do in the last year? How have you experienced God's goodness in your family? And I think creating that space in a church context can then give parents tools to do that in the home. And I think that's something that I feel like we can do well in the church, is create these spaces that then give parents tools that can be very easily and simply translated into the home. How to ask questions, what does that look like with our children? And again, allowing kids to hear parents' answers. So I think it's also going to parents, you can answer these questions too. And actually you answering them and you giving your children sort of a frame or picture onto how your relationship with God is going to help them understand what faith looks like and how we can how God is part of our everyday life. So
absolutely, and that would inspire other parents too. Those who are perhaps struggling a bit, to hear those things could be really inspiring too.
Yeah, definitely.
If I'd love to hear, final questions, please do put them in the chat now, and we can ask them to Sarah.
Got time for one or two questions, so do put them in the chat.
Whilst you're typing away, hopefully. Just want to say, Sarah, you mentioned about hearing the voice of young people in those different settings. In Southwark Diocese, we've started youth forums in our different episcopal areas. And in fact, we've got 2 happening this Saturday afternoon for the Woolwich area and one from the Croydon area. We've already held the one in the Kingston area, but we're asking the young people about their views on the climate crisis and the response of the church. There's still time for young people to sign up. Do email Kelly if you've got young people that might be interested on that. But what we're doing as a diocese is we want to model what we hope happens at parish level. So we make a video from our Zoom discussion, and that's now being shown in our diocesan synod. So we kind of we realise that young people probably wouldn't want to sit through a synod meeting, but we're trying to get their voice in a way that is useful, and we're hoping that churches will start to listen to their young people. We've also got a toolkit available. I'm just popping that in the chat now, that you can download off our website. And there are different booklets, and one of them is about decision making and inclusion. So if your church is trying to think through, well, how do we hear the voice of young people a bit more, maybe pick up that booklet and have a look through, and there's some helpful questions for you to think through how that could be in your setting. We've also got a booklet on starting out, so if you're trying to set your vision, that sort of thing, that would be something that you can do. I think we've got a question here. Katie, do you want to read that one out from Jen?
Yeah, well, just her reflections. Good to hear what you're taking away. Like, if you want to put your answer to that last question that Levi put in the chat, I'd also encourage you to go and tell somebody that you work with, whether it's your church leader or one of your volunteers, like, what is it that you're taking from this space, and be held accountable. If you share it with someone, then it is probably going to help you actually do it. But yeah, Jen, great to hear. You want to provide a safe space for kids to talk, draw, make things they would like to ask God. Amazing. Love that. And great that it's been encouraging. Thank you for your message. Great. Alex, you've joined us from South America, from Brazil. That is lovely, international element. That's excellent. But yeah, if you have any questions following this, Sarah, is there any way we can get in touch with you, or if people want to hear more of what you're doing? I know you've got a webinar coming up shortly, which Levi has just put a link to in the chat. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the website. It's not a very good website, but it's just my little way of keeping in touch with people. So feel free to contact me via that. But yes, one thing which has really been coming out strongly is this thing of, what do people really think about children's faith, how valuable it is and so on, because that impacts them, how they do things, and that's in the family context or the church context. So Howard Worsley, who many of you will know, he was my PhD supervisor, and we've just had so many exciting, stimulating conversations about this kind of thing over the years. So I said to him, let's get together and do a conversation there. So I think that'll be really fascinating. For those you know Howard, he's very insightful, and also he does ask those poignant questions, but also has such a lot of huge wealth of experience to give. So that's yes, you can book online for that. It's a free webinar, so that will be an interesting conversation, I think, there.
Yeah, that would be great. So yeah, there's a link if you want to sign up to that. Howard is excellent. He was also my dissertation supervisor for my undergrad, so can also rate him.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then in terms of other things we've got coming up, we've got our next gathering like this with Southwark and London together is, I'm just stepping, on the 30th of July. I'm sure lots of you will be aware of the recent things that have come out of the Church of England, the living in love and faith. And we're going to spend some time reflecting on that. We've got one of the people who are part of that formation group of that paper to come and help us reflect on how that affects children and young people. So do come and join us for that. And prayer, if you want to come pray for children and young people, Wednesdays at 12 o'clock. Hopefully Levo will put the link in the chat, and we would love to see you there. But Sarah, just before, I know you've got to head off, is there anything that we can pray for you? We love to pray for our guests. Is there anything we can pray for? What you're doing?
I've no idea. No, I just think that kids and family ministry as a whole is doing phenomenal work in really difficult times. So anything that we can all do to help with that is just incredible, really. Yeah.
Cool.
Shall I pray? I'll pray. Father God, I thank you for Sarah and everything that she's shared. I thank you for her role as a mum, her role as a researcher, her role as a volunteer in a church, and her passion to make Jesus known to the next generation. Lord, I pray that you will bless her in her work and bless her now as she goes on to do a teaching session straight away. So Lord, give her the energy that she needs for that. And I pray for everybody here as we consider how to re-engage with those families. Lord, I really pray for your inspiration and for your leading to know how to best move things forward in your context. And we really pray that that you will be known to the next generation of children and young people, and that they'll be really excited to be on a journey with you throughout the whole of their lives. And we just ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Sarah, thank you so much for being with us and sharing all that you have. It's excellent to hear. And see you soon.